April 16, 1961. The Oval Office. Midnight. The rain in Washington, D.C. didn't wash things clean. It just made the city look like a blurred watercolor painting, dissolving into gray. Inside the Oval Office, the air was stale, recycled, and thick with the smell of cigarette smoke and fear. John F. Kennedy stood by the French doors, staring out into the black wetness of the Rose Garden. He was 43 years old, the youngest man ever elected to this office, and tonight, he looked like a child who had wandered into a burning building. His back was hurting, that constant, gnawing agony in his lumbar spine that he hid with a smile and a medley of painkillers. But tonight, the pain in his back was nothing compared to the sickness in his gut. The phone on the heavy oak desk rang. It was a shrill, mechanical sound that made the other men in the room jump. "Get it," Jack said. He didn't turn around. McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor, picked up the receiver. He listened for a moment, his face draining of color. He placed the phone back in the cradle with a soft click. "Mr. President," Bundy said, his voice tight, "it's the beach. The landing force is under heavy fire. They say Castro's tanks are moving, and the T-33 jets are chewing them up." Kennedy turned. His face was pale, his eyes hooded. "Tanks? The CIA told me there were no tanks within 50 miles of the Bay of Pigs. They told me the swamp would bog them down." "The CIA was wrong, sir," Bundy whispered. In the corner of the room, sitting in a shadow that seemed appropriate for him, was Bobby. Robert F. Kennedy, the Attorney General, the brother, the protector. He was leaning forward, elbows on knees, staring at the floor. He looked like a coiled spring, ready to snap at anyone who came too close. "They weren't wrong, Jack," Bobby said, his voice low and dangerous. "They lied. The sales pitch 3 months earlier. To understand the betrayal, you have to understand the seduction. It hadn't started with gunfire. It had started with a pointer on a map in the cabinet room 3 months ago. Allen Dulles, the director of Central Intelligence, had stood there like a kindly old professor. With his tweed jacket, his pipe, and his grandfatherly mustache, Dulles looked harmless. He was a legend. He was the man who had overthrown governments in Iran and Guatemala with a phone call and a suitcase of cash. "It will be a surgical strike, Mr. President," Dulles had said, tapping the map of Cuba. "We have a brigade of Cuban exiles, patriots. They land here at the Bay of Pigs. The moment they hit the beach, the population will rise up against Castro. The militia will defect. It will be a chain reaction. Castro will fall within 72 hours. Jack had asked the hard questions. "No American troops. No American air support. I campaigned on not intervening. I won't start a war." "Of course not, sir," Richard Bissell, the CIA's deputy director of plans, had assured him. Bissell was the tall, brilliant, arrogant architect of the plan. "The brigade has its own B-26 bombers. We've painted them with Cuban markings. The world will think it's an internal revolution. America's fingerprints won't be on the gun." "And if it fails?" Jack had asked. "If the landing fails?" Dulles had smiled, a patronizing, pitying smile. "It cannot fail, Mr. President. And even if the beach is held, the brigade will simply melt into the Escambray Mountains and become guerrillas. It is a no-lose scenario." It was a beautiful, perfect lie. There were no Escambray Mountains near the Bay of Pigs, only 80 miles of impenetrable swamp. There was no uprising planned. And the Cuban Air Force was a fiction. Dulles and Bissell knew the invasion would fail without the U.S. Marines. They knew the exiles would be slaughtered. But they had calculated that once the shooting started, the young, inexperienced president would panic. They thought that when Jack saw the disaster unfolding, he would be forced to send in the Navy to save face. They weren't betting on the invasion succeeding. They were betting on Kennedy caving in. April 17, 1961, 2 a.m. The trap snaps shut. The door to the Oval Office opened. General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, walked in, followed by Admiral Arleigh Burke. These were men of iron. They had fought World War II. They looked at Kennedy not as a commander, but as a temporary occupant of the chair. "Mr. President," Admiral Burke said, his voice booming. The situation is critical. The brigade is pinned down. Their ammunition ships, the Houston and the Rio Escondido, have been sunk by Castro's aircraft. They have no supplies. They are being slaughtered. Kennedy walked to his desk and sat down. He picked up a paperweight, a coconut shell from the Pacific War, and turned it over in his hands. What do you propose, Admiral? Kennedy asked. Air cover, sir, Burke said immediately. The aircraft carrier Essex is sitting off the coast. I have 4 Skyhawks on the deck, fueled and armed. Let me launch them. Let me shoot down Castro's planes and cover the landing. No, Kennedy said. The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Mr. President, General Lemnitzer stepped forward, his face reddening. If we do not intervene, we lose the brigade. These men are patriots. We trained them. We sent them there. We cannot let them die. You told me, Kennedy said, his voice rising, that this operation would succeed without American intervention. You told me the Cuban people would rise up. Where is the uprising, General? Where are the defecting militias? The uprising is contingent on the brigade's success, Lemnitzer argued, and they cannot succeed without air support. You must authorize the strike. Bobby stood up. He walked over to the generals. He was smaller than them, scrawnier, but he radiated an intensity that made them step back. You guaranteed the president, Bobby hissed, pointing a finger at Lemnitzer's chest, that this plan would work on its own. Now, in the middle of the night, you change the rules? You want him to start a war. We want to win, Burke shouted. We are America. We do not lose to a bearded communist in the Caribbean. Kennedy rubbed his eyes. He saw the trap now. It was illuminated in the harsh light of the disaster. If he sent in the planes, the Soviets would know. Khrushchev would move on Berlin, could trigger a nuclear exchange. If he didn't send the planes, the brigade would die. He would be humiliated. He would be the president who lost Cuba forever. Dulles and the military had backed him into a corner, assuming he would choose war over humiliation. I said no, Kennedy repeated. His voice was shaking, not with fear, but with a cold, realized fury. I will not commit U.S. forces. I will not start World War III because you people botched the intelligence. Mr. President, Burke started. That is all, Admiral, Kennedy snapped. You have your orders. The ships stay over the horizon. The planes stay on the deck. The generals stared at him with open contempt. They saluted, a slow, insulting gesture, and turned on their heels, marching out of the room. The door closed. The silence returned. The brother's keeper. Jack slumped in his chair. He looked physically shrunken. The pain in his back was spasming now. They played me, Bobby, Jack whispered. They played me for a fool. Bobby walked around the desk. He poured a glass of water and handed it to his brother. They didn't play you, Jack. They tried to break you. They knew, Jack said, looking at the map where the little flags marked the dying brigade. Dulles knew. Bissell knew. They knew the uprising was a myth. They knew the swamps were impassable. They wanted this to happen. Why? Bobby asked, though he suspected the answer. Because they think I'm weak, Jack said. He slammed the coconut shell onto the desk. They look at me and they see a rich kid. They see a playboy. They think they're the permanent government and I'm just a passing inconvenience. They thought that once the blood started flowing, I'd panic and give them their war. He stood up and limped to the window again. I should have fired them, Jack said. I should have fired Dulles the day I walked in here. I listened to the experts. I listened to the legends. And look where it got us. The phone rang again. It was the Situation Room. Mr. President, the operator said, we have a message from the beach commander, Pepe San Roman. Read it, Jack said. We are out of ammo. We are fighting in the water. We can see the American ships. Why don't you help us? Do you people have no soul? Jack closed his eyes. He felt the weight of every bullet hitting a body on that beach. He had signed the order. He had sent them there. He hung up the phone. He turned to Bobby. His eyes were dry, but they were haunted. I need you to do something for me, Bobby. Anything, Jack. I need you to go to the CIA tomorrow. I want you to look Bissell in the eye. I want you to tear that building apart brick by brick until we find out who lied, who knew, and who set this up. I'll handle it, Bobby said. I'll make them wish they'd never heard the name Kennedy. No, Jack said. He walked over to Bobby and grabbed him by the shoulders. His grip was surprisingly strong. It's not about revenge, Bobby. It's about survival. If these people can do this to me, if they can lie to the president and try to force a war, then they are more dangerous than the Russians. Jack leaned in close. I want to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the winds. The quote would become famous later. But tonight it wasn't a soundbite. It was a declaration of war. Jack looked at the clock. It was 4 a.m. The sun was coming up over a ruined presidency. They think they trapped me, Jack whispered. They think I'm finished. But they forgot one thing. What's that? Bobby asked. They forgot that I learn fast. Jack straightened his tie. He winced as his back seized up, but he forced himself to stand tall. Go home, Bobby. Get some sleep. Tomorrow the press is going to eat us alive. We have to be ready. And the CIA? Bobby asked. Jack's face hardened into a mask of cold resolve. Tomorrow, Jack said, I start firing people. April 20th, 1961. The Cabinet Room.
10 Uhr AM.
The silence in the Cabinet Room was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on everyone's shoulders. It was the silence of a funeral. John F. Kennedy sat at the center of the long mahogany table. He was reading the casualty list. It wasn't a list of names yet, the Cubans hadn't released them, but it was a list of numbers. 1,189 prisoners. 114 dead. The rest missing in the swamps. These were men the CIA had recruited in Miami bars. Men whose fathers JFK had met. Men he had promised to support. Now they were rotting in Castro's prisons, being paraded on television like trophies. Sitting across from him were the architects of the disaster, Allen Dulles and Richard Bissell. Allen Dulles was 68 years old. He was the great white case officer. He had served every president since Wilson. He smoked his pipe with a rhythmic, wet-sucking sound that usually signaled thoughtful wisdom. Today it sounded like a leaky valve. Richard Bissell, the tall, brilliant Yale economist who ran the clandestine service, looked like a man who had been hollowed out. His arrogance, usually his defining feature, was gone. Well, Kennedy said. He didn't look up from the paper. I'm waiting. Dulles cleared his throat. He tapped his pipe into the heavy glass ashtray. Mr. President, Dulles began, his voice steady, paternal. In the intelligence business, there are risks. We calculated the odds. The variables changed. Castro's reaction speed was faster than anticipated. The brigade fought well, but... Stop, Kennedy said. He finally looked up. His eyes were cold, devoid of the charm that the cameras loved. Don't give me the intelligence business speech, Allen. I'm not a tourist. I asked you specific questions. I asked about the morale of the Cuban people. You told me it was a powder keg waiting for a match. It wasn't. Our sources indicated. Bissell tried to interject. Your sources were lying to you, Kennedy snapped. Or you were lying to me. Which is it, Richard? Were you incompetent? Or were you deceitful? Bobby Kennedy was sitting next to his brother. He wasn't taking notes. He was staring at Bissell with the intensity of a prosecutor who already has the guilty verdict in his pocket. You told us, Bobby said, his voice cutting through the room, that if the landing failed, the men would escape to the Escambray Mountains. I looked at a map this morning, Richard. A real map. Not the one you showed us 3 months ago. Bobby stood up and walked to the wall map. He slammed his hand against the southern coast of Cuba. The Escambray Mountains are 80 miles away, 80 miles through a swamp that is infested with crocodiles. There was no escape route. You knew that. You knew that if they got stuck on that beach, they died unless the U.S. Marines came in. Bissell looked down at his hands. We assumed the president would authorize the airstrikes if the situation became critical. There it was, the confession. Kennedy leaned back in his chair. He felt a spike of pain in his spine, but he ignored it. "You assumed," Kennedy said quietly. "You assumed you could force my hand. You assumed that once the shooting started, I would be too scared of losing to say no. You gambled with my presidency, and you gambled with those men's lives." Dulles spoke up, his tone hardening. He wasn't used to being dressed down by a man young enough to be his son. "Mr. President, we are fighting a global war against communism. Sometimes you have to commit. You have to be willing to use power. We gave you a plan. You watered it down. You cut the airstrikes. You changed the landing site. You made it fail." The room went deadly still. No one spoke to the president like that. Kennedy looked at Dulles. He saw the history there, the coups in Iran, in Guatemala. He saw a man who believed the CIA was the real government, and the president was just a temporary employee. "I am the president," Kennedy said, his voice ice-cold. "I am the responsible officer of this government. I took the oath. You didn't." He stood up. The meeting was over. "I have to go face the American people," Kennedy said. "I have to go on television and tell them that I authorized a disaster. I will take the blame. I will not hide behind my advisors." He walked to the door, then stopped and turned back to Dulles. "But make no mistake, Alan. Things are going to change. I am not going to live in a world where my intelligence chiefs try to manipulate me into war." Dulles puffed on his pipe. "We serve at your pleasure, Mr. President." "Yes," Kennedy said. "You do." April 21, 1961. The State Department press conference. The lights were blinding. The heat from the television cameras made the auditorium feel like a sauna. Hundreds of reporters were shouting, waving their hands. Kennedy walked to the podium. He gripped the sides of it. He looked calm, handsome, in control. But inside he felt like he was bleeding out. "Mr. President," a reporter yelled, "is it true that the CIA planned this invasion without your full knowledge?" Kennedy leaned into the microphone. He could have destroyed Dulles right there. He could have leaked the truth that he was lied to. It would have saved his approval ratings. But he knew that a president who whines about his subordinates looks weak. "I want to make it clear," Kennedy said, his voice steady. "I am the responsible officer of this government. The buck stops here." He took it all. The failure, the stupidity, the tragedy. Back in the wings of the stage, Bobby watched his brother. He saw the tension in Jack's jaw. He knew what this was costing him. As Jack walked off the stage, sweat dripping down his back, he grabbed Bobby's arm. "Did I look like a fool?" Jack asked. "You looked like a leader," Bobby said. "Good," Jack whispered. "Now let's go fire some people." The purge. The firing of Alan Dulles could not be immediate. It had to be done with the precision of a surgical amputation. If Kennedy fired the legendary spy chief the day after the failure, it would look like panic. It would turn the CIA against him. It had to be a retirement. A few months later, Kennedy invited Dulles to the White House for a final meeting. They sat on the patio drinking iced tea. It was civilized. It was polite. "Alan," Kennedy said, "I think it's time." Dulles nodded. He knew the game. "I understand, Mr. President. I will submit my resignation." "I want to give you a medal," Kennedy said. "The National Security Medal. For a lifetime of service." It was the ultimate political move. Kill them with kindness. But after Dulles left, Kennedy went back to the Oval Office where Bobby was waiting. "He's gone," Jack said. "And Bissell?" Bobby asked. "He's gone too. I'm bringing in John McCone, a Republican, an outsider, someone who will actually control that place." Kennedy sat down at his desk. He picked up a report from the Joint Chiefs of Staff regarding Vietnam. They were recommending sending combat troops. Jack threw the report into the trash can. "I'm never trusting the experts again," Jack said. "They have their own agenda, Bobby. The military wants war. The CIA wants coups. They all have a hammer, so everything looks like a nail." "What are you going to do?" Bobby asked. "I'm going to build my own intelligence network," Jack said. "I want you to be my eyes and ears. I want you to sit in on the CIA meetings. I want you to go to the Pentagon. If they sneeze, I want to know about it. I'm the Attorney General, Jack. I'm supposed to be chasing the mob. The mob can wait, Jack said. These people, the ones in the gray suits, they are the real threat. They almost got me into a nuclear war over a swamp in Cuba. Jack stood up and walked over to the globe in the corner. He spun it. Khrushchev thinks I'm weak now, Jack said. He saw the Bay of Pigs. He thinks I'm a boy who can be pushed around. He's gonna test me, Bobby. I can feel it. He's gonna try something big. Let him try, Bobby said. No, Jack said, stopping the globe with his hand. If he tries something now, and the military gives me bad advice again, we're all dead. The lesson. The Bay of Pigs changed John F. Kennedy. The smiling, optimistic young man who had been inaugurated in January was gone. In his place was a skeptic, a cynic, a man who read every memo 3 times, who looked for the trap in every proposal. He reorganized the White House. He brought in his own military advisor, General Maxwell Taylor, to bypass the Joint Chiefs. He ordered Bobby to become the enforcer, the bad cop who terrified the bureaucrats. But the biggest change was internal. One night in November, Jack and Bobby were sitting on the Truman balcony, looking out at the Washington Monument. You know what the scary part is? Jack asked, lighting a cigar. What? If I had listened to them, if I had sent in the planes, we would be fighting the Russians right now. I was the only thing standing between the advice of the experts and Armageddon. You made the right call, Bobby said. I made the right call by doing nothing, Jack corrected. Next time, I might not have that luxury. Next time, I might have to act. Jack looked at his brother. The smoke from his cigar drifted into the night air. They are going to come at me again, Bobby. The CIA. The Joint Chiefs. They haven't forgiven me for not starting their war. They think I'm a traitor to the cause. I'll watch your back, Bobby said. I know you will, Jack smiled. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. But who's watching theirs? Jack didn't know it then, but the test he feared was already being prepared. In the shipyards of the Soviet Union, missiles were being loaded onto freighters. They were heading for Cuba. The Bay of Pigs had been a dress rehearsal. The real show was about to begin. And this time, there would be no room for lies. October 16, 1962. The Cabinet Room.
11:50 a.m.
The ghost of the Bay of Pigs walked into the room 18 months later. It didn't carry a gun. It carried a stack of black and white photographs taken from 70,000 feet. John F. Kennedy sat at the table. He was older now. The boyishness was gone, replaced by deep lines around his eyes and a permanent set to his jaw. He looked at the photos. Even to the untrained eye, the shapes were unmistakable. Medium-range ballistic missiles, Soviet-made, sitting in a clearing near San Cristobal, Cuba. They can hit Washington in 15 minutes, CIA analyst Art Lundahl said. His voice was clinical, detached. They can wipe out the entire eastern seaboard. 80 million casualties. The room erupted. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were there. The new CIA director, John McCone, was there. The experts were back. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff, chomped on his cigar. He was a man who measured success in tonnage of explosives dropped. He looked at Kennedy with open disdain. Mr. President, LeMay growled, this is it. We have to hit them. Airstrikes. Tonight. Wipe out the sites, then invade. If we don't, we look like cowards. It's Munich all over again. Kennedy looked at LeMay. He heard the same certainty, the same arrogance that he had heard from Allen Dulles and Admiral Burke in April 1961. It will be easy. It will be surgical. The Soviets won't react. General, Kennedy said, his voice quiet, if we attack, will the Soviets attack Berlin? They won't dare, LeMay scoffed. We have the strategic advantage. We have to squeeze them. Kennedy looked at his brother. Bobby was sitting across the table, his eyes locked on Jack's. They shared a silent communication, a language built on the ashes of the Bay of Pigs. They are doing it again, Jack's eyes said. They are trying to trap me into a war. We are not bombing, Kennedy announced. Not yet, Mr. President, LeMay shouted, his face turning purple. That is almost treason. You are letting them hold a gun to our head. In 1961, Kennedy would have withered under that accusation. He would have worried about looking weak. But this was 1962. Kennedy stood up. He leaned over the table, staring LeMay down. General, you were the one who told me the Bay of Pigs was a sure thing. You were the one who told me the CIA's intelligence was perfect. I listened to you then. I'm not listening to you now. We are going to blockade the island. We are going to give Khrushchev a way out. A blockade. LeMay spat. That's a weak response. It's the response that doesn't incinerate the planet by Tuesday, Kennedy said. Meeting adjourned. October 27, 1962. Black Saturday. 12 days of hell. The world stood on the razor's edge. The blockade was in place. Russian ships were steaming toward the quarantine line. In the White House, the ExComm Executive Committee was meeting around the clock. The smell of stale coffee and unwashed bodies filled the room. Then the news broke. A U-2 spy plane, piloted by Major Rudolf Anderson, had been shot down over Cuba by a Soviet SAM missile. The pilot was dead. The military demanded blood. The standing orders were clear. If a U-2 is shot down, the U.S. attacks the SAM site immediately. The generals were in the Oval Office within minutes. They fired the first shot, Mr. President, General Maxwell Taylor said. We have to retaliate. The planes are fueled. We launch at dawn. Then the invasion begins. It was the moment of maximum danger. The trap had snapped shut again. An American was dead.
Honor demanded war.
Kennedy sat in his rocking chair. He was in agony. His back was spasming so badly he could barely think. But his mind went back to that night in April 1961. He remembered the CIA lying about the Cuban uprising. He remembered the pressure to save face. If I invade Cuba, Kennedy thought, the Russians in Cuba will fight. They have tactical nuclear weapons on the beach. We didn't know about them in '61, but my gut tells me they are there now. History would prove him right. The Soviets had battlefield nukes ready to use against an invasion force. No, Kennedy said. Sir, we do not attack, Kennedy said. It might have been an accident. A rogue commander. We are not starting World War III over one plane. Mr. President, this is dereliction of duty, LeMay shouted. Kennedy ignored him. He turned to Bobby. Bobby, Jack whispered. Get out of here. Go see Dobrynin. Tonight. Anatoly Dobrynin was the Soviet ambassador. What do I tell him? Bobby asked. Tell him we have to make a deal, Jack said. Tell him I'll take our Jupiter missiles out of Turkey if they take their missiles out of Cuba. But tell him we have to do it secretly. If the military finds out I'm trading missiles, they'll coup me. Jack, that's political suicide, Bobby said. Trading missiles? The Republicans will eat you alive. Better to be eaten alive than incinerated, Jack said. Go. And Bobby, don't take a car. Walk. Don't let the FBI see you. The Justice Department. Midnight. Bobby walked into the Soviet embassy through the back door. He looked exhausted. He met Dobrynin in a private room. It was the most important conversation in human history. My brother is being pushed to the wall, Bobby told the Russian. The generals want a war. They are demanding an invasion within 24 hours. If you don't remove those missiles, he can't stop them. We cannot just retreat, Dobrynin said. It is a matter of honor for Chairman Khrushchev. We will give you the missiles in Turkey, Bobby said. But we can never write it down. It has to be a gentleman's agreement. If you speak of it publicly, we will deny it. Dobrynin looked at the young Attorney General. He saw the desperation in his eyes. He realized that the Kennedys were fighting two wars, one against the Soviets and one against their own military. I will relay the message, Dobrynin said. October 28, 1962. The morning. The sun rose over Washington. In the Oval Office, Jack Kennedy waited. The teletype machine in the corner began to chatter. Flash. Moscow radio. Khrushchev announces dismantling of offensive weapons in Cuba. Jack closed his eyes. He let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 13 days. It was over. Khrushchev had blinked. Or rather, they had blinked together. The generals were furious. LeMay called it the greatest defeat in our history. They didn't know about the secret trade. They thought Kennedy had just gotten lucky. But Jack knew the truth. He had won because he had learned the lesson of the Bay of Pigs. He had learned to say no to the experts. The final conversation. That evening, the White House was quiet. The crowds outside were cheering. The world was celebrating survival. Jack and Bobby sat alone in the Oval Office. No ads, no generals, just two brothers. Jack was sitting at the desk, signing a letter to the widow of Major Anderson, the pilot who died. "We did it," Bobby said, pouring 2 drinks. He handed one to Jack. Jack took the glass. He didn't drink immediately. He stared at the amber liquid. "You know what LeMay said to me?" Jack asked. "What?" "He said I should have invaded. He said I missed my chance to destroy Castro and Russia in one afternoon." Jack took a sip of the drink. He looked up at Bobby. His eyes were hard, harder than they had ever been. "I remember what you told me," Jack said. "After the Bay of Pigs. You said I needed to watch my back." "Yeah. Well," Jack said, leaning forward, "I think we just painted a target on it." "What do you mean?" "The CIA, the Pentagon, the hardliners. We just humiliated them, Bobby. We proved them wrong. We proved that diplomacy works better than their bombs. We took away their war." Jack stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rose garden, just as he had 18 months ago. "They lied to me in '61 because they thought I was a fool," Jack said. "Now they hate me because I'm not." He turned back to his brother. "But we beat them, Bobby. We beat the spies, and we beat the generals, and we beat the Soviets. We're still here. We're still here," Bobby repeated. Jack smiled, that dazzling million-watt smile that had charmed the world. But there was a shadow behind it now. "I told you I wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces," Jack said softly. "I didn't do it. I tried to control them. But after this, after seeing how hungry they were for a war," he set the glass down on the resolute desk. "In the second term," Jack promised, "I'm going to finish the job. We're going to get out of Vietnam. We're going to end the Cold War. And I'm going to break the power of those men in the gray suits forever." Bobby nodded. "I'm with you, Jack. All the way." Jack walked over and put his hand on Bobby's shoulder. "I know. You're the only one I can trust. The only one who doesn't have an agenda." They stood there for a moment, the two most powerful men in the world, surrounded by enemies in their own government. "Go home to Ethel," Jack said. "Kiss the kids. We survived." Bobby walked to the door. He turned back one last time. "Good night, Mr. President." "Good night, Bobby." Epilogue: The Price of Skepticism. John F. Kennedy had learned the lesson of the Bay of Pigs perfectly. He had learned that the deep state, the intelligence agencies, and the military-industrial complex had its own momentum, its own desires, and that those desires often led to war. He had learned to trust his own judgment. He had learned to use his brother as his shield. But he had made powerful enemies. General LeMay would never forgive him. The CIA operatives who lost their friends at the Bay of Pigs would never forgive him. The hardliners who thought he sold out on Cuba would never forgive him. 13 months later, November 1963, Dallas. As the motorcade turned onto Elm Street, the sun was shining. Jack was smiling. He had survived the Bay of Pigs. He had survived the missile crisis. He had kept the peace. But as the shots rang out, echoing off the concrete canyon of Dealey Plaza, the war between the president and his own shadows finally came to an end. The men in the gray suits had lost the battle for Cuba, but they ultimately won the war for control. And somewhere in the chaos of that day, Bobby Kennedy would remember his brother's words from that rainy night in April 1961. "They are more dangerous than the Russians."